Hello Internet and welcome to another video on this channel. I admit something I wasn't sure was ever actually going to happen, but here we are. Well, during the time I haven't been making videos, I have actually gotten 75 extra subscribers, so maybe doing this is a really terrible idea, and the success of having a successful channel is just to not do anything, but whatever, here we are. My friend Vanessa has asked me to make this video because she is actually a descendant of the person we're going to be talking about today. So, who is that? Well, we're going to talk about Sir Thomas Stucley, Lord of the Manor of Affeton, an English mercenary, Catholic recusant, and rebel against Elizabeth I of England. He is not one of those people that most know about today, and he's not one of those people that are sort of immediately famous or incredibly well known, but he is one of those lovable rogues, wonderful rapscallions that so gave colour to the Elizabethan Tudor era. So yeah, here is to a video about Thomas Lusty Stucley, for my friend Vanessa, and also because he has the best nickname of all time. Stucley was born in 1525 to a Hugh Stucley, who was Lord of the Manor of Affeton, later Sheriff of Devon, and while not in the inner circle of Henry VIII, he was a Knight of the Body. There is some indication, or at least people at the time thought that Thomas might have been the illegitimate son of Henry VIII. It was well known, of course, that Henry had multiple affairs all around. Look at the amount of people he had affairs with before he then married them and beheaded them. But, at least if that was the case, Thomas's mother Anne never got to that particular point in their relationship. But, of course, Henry might have appointed Hugh as his Knight of the Body because he was running an affair with his wife. That was, the style of the time. Whatever the truth about this, Thomas grew up within a sort of military tradition. His first really early mentor that we know about was Charles Brandon, the first Duke of Suffolk, who was eventually also Bishop of Exeter, who was one of Henry VIII's great childhood friends, and who in fact married Henry's sister, although that marriage caused a lot of trouble, but we're not going into a whole amount of Tudor intrigue here within Henry VIII's court. The point is, Charles Brandon was, amongst other things, a military commander, and as one of Stucley's mentors, Stucley sort of got into that profession. He was, amongst other things, present at Boulogne when that city was sieged and taken by British forces during the autumn and winter of 1544 and 1545. Eventually, he was made standard bearer at Boulogne, so he was starting to rise sort of in the service of the military, and might in fact have gotten to great heights if there hadn't been one of those Tudor intrigues I told you about, and Charles Brandon, well, he fell. He didn't fall so much as he was made to fall, but he lost his position, and instead Stucley entered the service of Edward Seymour, the first Duke of Somerset, who was another one of those wonderful people who basically rose in Tudor times by being related to people that Henry VIII have married. In fact, Edward Seymour was the first regent after Henry VIII's death for the minority of Edward VI, who was, of course, the king who actually followed Henry, although he did not last particularly long. Well, that didn't last particularly long either, because already in 1551, Edward Seymour, the first Duke of Somerset, was then removed from his position by other nobles, and during the purges that followed that, an arrest warrant was also issued against Stucley, but at that point he managed to escape to France and actually served in the French army for a while. This was probably where his, overall career as a military man was finally settled. It also shows already by then that he didn't really have any deep, abiding loyalty to England, as you can see. He just started serving in France, but he did have military talents. He wasn't a bad commander as such, and even someone like Henri de Montmorency, who was one of the most powerful and important French military commanders at the time, took notice of him. And he was in fact sent back to England with sort of a recommended diplomacy letter by the King of France to Edward VI of England, because of course Stucley was supposed to be that dude's half-brother, so, you know, there could have been something there. Immediately when he arrived back in England, he then revealed that the French had plans to attack and reconquer Calais. Now, the English had held Calais ever since the end of the 100 Years' War. It was, in fact, all that remained of the old, really large English empire in France. And, well, now was the time the French wanted to take them back, and Stucley immediately revealed that when he came back. So, he had left England, served with the French, then was sent back to England by the French, and immediately betrayed the French to tell them about this attack on Calais. The fun part is, there is every single bit of evidence that the attack of Calais might actually have been planned by Stucley himself. This is what I said. What a lovely, 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 wonderful rogue he was, wasn't he? Anyway, the plans that he might have had about this didn't go entirely as he had expected, because at that point the English really didn't want to be hostile to the French. So instead, the then regent for Edward VI basically pretended to disbelieve what Stucley said, told the French king that no one could believe him to be, you know, doing such a terrible thing, and threw Stucley into the Tower of London for 8 months. This might be the first time where Stucley was like, okay, this is the second time England really have done naughty stuff to me, so this is probably where some of his every man for himself attitude later in life might have come up. However, at this point his brother was dead, and Stucley had also run through his inheritance really quickly, so he was also prosecuted for debt as soon as he got out of the tower in 1553, and was basically compelled to become a mercenary once more. And in fact, the biggest problem Mr. Stucley usually had was financial. Basically, when claiming a legacy from someone who had mentioned him in his will, he broke into that person's house and searched his treasure chest, despite the courts telling him he absolutely could not do that. So, yeah, and he was also sued by some Irish noblemen for ripping him off, which put him back into the Tower of London for a while, so much so that he once again decided this would be a good time to go abroad. Anyway, after another year abroad, he eventually managed to return back to England with Emmanuel Philbert, who was Duke of Savoy at the time, and who Stucley had apparently struck up some kind of deal with. He in fact managed to obtain an amnesty against being sued for debt by his various creditors. Who have done this? We don't know, but it might have been the Duke of Suffolk, his first mentor, who was still alive, if mostly out of power, but I mean, he was still a duke, so there were things he could do. And he also got more of a credit line by his marriage to Anne Curtis, who was a wealthy heiress. The problem was, if Stucley was nothing else, he did like a good, happy life, and he was basically a dissolute philanderer. He was known to spend like £100 a day. Now, £100 today doesn't sound like very much, but it's worth noticing that in 1554, as this was, or 1555, you could basically buy a servant for life for possibly less than £2 a year. So yeah, this dude liked money, and he very much liked to spend them. So, despite his marriage to a rich girl, within only a few months, he was again arrested, or at least they tried to arrest him for a charge of counterfeiting and debt issues, and once again he deserted his wife and ran away to the continent, where he then entered directly into the service of the Duke of Savoy. And this is where his, rise to glory actually begins, because what he did do then, almost immediately after, in 1557, was fight in the Battle of St. Quentin. Now, the Battle of St. Quentin is not important here, but it was one of the last battles of the Italian Wars. I have previously made a couple of videos about the Italian Wars, and I will link them down below, don't worry about it. But the Italian Wars was basically a series of wars between various Italian city-states, the Kingdom of France, and the Habsburg monarchy, which was, of course, basically the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish Empire over who should be ruling Italy. And the Battle of St. Quentin was one of the final battles where the Kingdom of France got spanked by the Holy Roman Empire with the Duke of Savoy in charge. And of course, at that point, Stucley was one of the Duke's sub-commanders in this very famous battle. So, this is where you would think that his star was rising. If you think that, you haven't really been paying attention to what I told you about his career, because it was only the next year, in 1558, that he was summoned back to England before the Royal Council for a charge of piracy. So, I guess as a mercenary, he still needed a way to get money. But, however, he was, once more when it came to court, acquitted, because there wasn't really sufficient evidence, and he managed to actually retain the personal favor of Queen Mary of England. Now, this is where I probably should remind everyone that Mary was a Catholic, like Stucley. That had something to do with it, but more importantly, she was married to Philip II of Spain. Philip II of Spain was basically a Catholic religious fanatic who wanted to maintain and expand the Spanish Empire, and who was also the great defender of Christendom. More specifically, the great defender of Catholic Christendom, considering the fact that it was under his rule that, the famous 80-year war up in the Spanish Netherlands happened. Nonetheless, he was married to Mary and was at least titular King of England at the time. So, remember Philip, he will come back in the story. During the time of 1558, where he retained the favor of Mary, the problem was Mary was already very sick with cancer at the time and died soon afterwards. However, Stucley had one of those stroke of lucks, I guess you can say, that characterized most of his career, because as soon as Elizabeth was on the throne, his wife's grandfather died, which means he came into even more money. And at that point he was like, okay, maybe I should try not to be quite as dissolute, and while I am a Catholic, I can live a good life here as a fairly wealthy man. So he basically accommodated himself to the Protestant succession of Elizabeth I of England, and in fact became a fairly ardent supporter of Sir Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Dudley is an interesting character that I might actually get into at one point, but the point is he was Elizabeth's best childhood friend and might in fact have been the man she always really loved. He was probably Elizabeth's real true love, and the problem was, of course, Elizabeth couldn't marry for various political reasons, and Dudley was married himself. There's a lot of things to go into with Dudley. I might eventually make a video about him, but the point is, Dudley was incredibly influential at Elizabeth's court. Of someone who wasn't like Walsingham or someone like that, Dudley was the man. So attaching himself to Dudley was a good decision by Stucley, and in fact he was eventually be given a captaincy at the castle of Berwick, where he basically lived very luxuriously over the winter of 1561, because that was a very, he had his wife's grandfather's money, and it was a very nice little sinecure. And more specifically, at Berwick was a Gaelic Irish nobleman called Shane O'Neill. Now, that is a name that would have some influence on his future. Stucley's future, obviously, because I think O'Neill was the one who gave him some interest in Ireland, and Ireland would absorb much of Stucley's remaining life, to be honest. However, at one point, he then decided that he wanted to be a sovereign prince of somewhere. He even told Elizabeth, before I am at the end of my life, I will be a sovereign prince. Elizabeth decided to basically humor him, and they entered into a small sort of funny conversation, although some say that they felt that Stucley had been rather rude to Elizabeth, and this might have been the original cause of the breach that later came between them. However, it wasn't enough to get Stucley out of intense favour, so in 1563 he came up with a plan, because at that time Florida, i.e. at the time Spanish Florida, was really hotly contested by the Spanish and French settlers who was getting in the south of America, while of course England was primarily in the north. And Stucley said, hey, we can get in of this. If you give me a ship and 100 men, I will sail over there and found a colony, so England also have something to say about it. And despite everything else, Elizabeth was like, okay, sure, let's do that. We can do that. So he got a ship, and he was allowed to get other ships, and he got some men, and he held a huge naval pageant in the Thames to show off for the Queen, and then he sailed off to Florida to find his new life and his new home in a wonderful little colony over there. Well, actually, he sailed for the coast of Munster in Ireland, where he immediately decided to go back to piracy, or privateering, I guess, and started plundering French, Spanish, and Portuguese ships as if his life depended on it. Which, of course, since at the time England was at peace with all of these nations, they decided to complain to Elizabeth, and she basically had to say, oh dear, oh dear. So she disavowed Stucley and sent another naval force over there and had him arrested. His ships was impounded, Stucley surrendered, and was once again put in the Tower of London. One would have to ask if he had his own cell there that he just basically kept around for when this was inevitably happening. However, his old friend Shane O'Neill pleaded his case, and once more he was acquitted. This is actually one of those things that are somewhat interesting, and we'll get back to that. That is the amount of acquittals he got in court, which is rather interesting for someone who, while a peripheral character at court, wasn't anyone super important, to be completely honest. Neither of these things would, of course, have endeared Elizabeth particularly to Stucley, so at this point it was probably clear that their relationship was a bit strained, to be honest, and it seems like also around this time that Dudley almost entirely disavowed Stucley. Also, of course, Dudley would die before all too long after that, so how much that would have done. Anyway, the point is, Stucley has, as I said, been interested in Ireland, and at first he tried to get the Queen to give him an official position over there, but when she was slow to do that, or if she had wanted to do that at all, he got into a captainship by the Lord Deputy over there, Sir Henry Sidney. So he was now serving in Ireland, and his job was basically to try to get O'Neill to enter negotiations with the government, his old friend O'Neill. So why would they do that? Well, you see, in all of English history in Ireland, and they have controlled Ireland for much of the last 1,000 years, there's always been that low-grade rebellion, usually springing up to a very high-grade rebellion every generation or so. It would, of course, eventually lead to, Irish final independence in the 1920s, and there is the Northern Ireland Quest. There's a lot of things, but the point is, almost as soon as the Normans got into England, they conquered Ireland, then they lost Ireland, then they conquered it again, blah, 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 blah. But England has mostly held on to Ireland for about 1,000 years, and there has always been, rebellions, either low-grade or high-grade rebellions. And Shane O'Neill was one of those low-grade rebellious lords who might become a high-grade rebellious lord. So Stucley, as his friend, was basically hired to, make sure that he stayed as loyal as he possibly could. It was then at this point that Stucley then tried to buy a hell of a lot of land area in Ireland. He would have become one of the great property holders in Ireland. He spent almost 3,000 English pounds in 1570s to get this land, but Elizabeth basically said, nope, 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 nope. This is not going to happen. We do not want someone like that to own such great importance and, rich land, especially since it's also of great strategic importance. Now, this, again, cannot possibly have made Stucley more positively inclined towards Elizabeth, but he continued basically to serve in Ireland for quite a few years until he was finally, in 1568, completely dismissed. Now, he was primarily dismissed because of, otherwise existing political disputes within the various rulers, or at least high English noblemen in England, but Elizabeth was at this time very, very tired of him, so she made no move to rescue him, and in fact said, well, if you hired Stucley, that's on you, nothing else is going to happen, because, there we are, because he is an idiot. And once again, Stucley was imprisoned. Well, this time, however, it was in Dublin Castle rather than in the Tower of London. So that must have been nice. It always tries to, use different kinds of prisons. It broadens your mind. What he was thrown in for, however, this time was not for once economic issues, but for swearing at the Queen and using rebellious language against her. So it seems like at this point he had really started getting tired of Elizabeth. His incipient Catholicism might be starting to peek through his just personal attempts of gaining wealth and power. And, well, I'm pretty sure he probably did say something naughty about Elizabeth at the time. But once again, he was acquitted. And like I said before, this is worth paying attention to. It shows how the power of the royals at the time, between the end of feudalism and the rise of absolutism, was actually not as great as people would think. Elizabeth would have had great interest in getting Stucley convicted if she actually bothered that much about him, but the courts kept acquitting this guy. It's actually fairly interesting regarding the development of modern-day state society. Yes, Stucley was a nobleman, otherwise he would never have been in those positive situations, but it's actually really interesting and one of those fascinating points of history where you can see the development basically from the Magna Carta in 1215 to modern day actual, legal societies. Very, very fascinating. Anyway, once he got out, he decided to break completely with Elizabeth and immediately suggested both to Philip II of Spain, see I told you he'd get back, as well as the French king that, hey, I would be happy to be general if you guys were going to invade England or Ireland. The French decided to hear him out because they were in the process of one of their interminable attempts to invade England that, of course, always came to naught. But, it was definitely worth, trying, and Stucley was someone who was, at the very least, in the area and had some kind of military experience, but it basically all came to naught in France. So eventually he went to Spain and started working directly for Philip II. Philip was like, oh, here's a man I can use, so let's start with giving him, some loyalty to me. So he loaded him with honors, gave him a house, gave him money, gave him, everything the man wanted except actual, military support, because these are the things he's doing. So he basically just spent a couple of years living in Madrid. Stucley seemed to have been popular there. The local men called him the Duke of Ireland, which could have been seen to be sort of a ironic title, but he seemed to actually have been fairly popular in Spain around this time. It also meant that he didn't really do much for a while. He might have been involved in the Rodolfo plot, but otherwise he basically just spent a couple of years living in luxury in Madrid. Now, the Rodolfo plot, in case anyone doesn't know it, was the plot conceived by one of the diplomats in London to break Mary Queen of Scots out of prison and replace Elizabeth with her, that eventually led to Mary's execution. But of course, like I said, Stucley might have been peripherally involved with the planning and plotting of this, but again, it all came to naught. Now, you would be excused for thinking that any smart man would basically spend the rest of their lives living in luxury in Madrid, in a happy little house, and being paid for by the Spanish king. But in that case, again, you haven't been paying attention to Stucley. He soon got involved with another invasion scheme of England, because France and Spain was at this time sort of thinking, maybe if we can't invade England, all of us, we can do it together, because the Pope had excommunicated Elizabeth. She probably didn't care, she was a Protestant, but he had excommunicated Elizabeth, which meant that, as the Catholic powers saw it, theoretically, there wasn't actually any legitimate ruler of England. So they could set up a pretender, invade, put that pretender on the throne, and all would be good. Stucley was involved with this, and once again, his Irish interest basically got the better of him, because he kept arguing, no, we need to invade Ireland. We need to invade Ireland, take that first, use it as a forward base to invade England. The problem was that the most powerful military commander of the Catholic powers at the time, the Duke of Alba, basically said, screw Ireland. If we take England, Ireland will fall easily. So that was the current plan, and Stucley was told, you will be leading actually a fairly significant military force in this, almost 15 companies of men, except that Stucley then said, yeah, but we really should go to Ireland, at which point everyone else said, no, we shouldn't, yes, we should, no, we shouldn't, no, yes, we should. And as everyone was saying that, the invasion plan collapsed amongst themselves, as they tended to do at the time. So his involvement with those kinds of feuding basically made Philip now think, oh, God, what have I gotten myself into? And it actually got worse a couple of years later when Stucley had an English spy expelled from Spain. Now, there is no doubt that this man was an English spy, and Stucley was probably filled with good motives in persecuting him, having him beat up, and basically kicked out of Spain by having him walk across the Pyrenees. The problem was, they didn't really have any evidence of this, and since their latest invasion plans have failed and they weren't actually at war, Elizabeth complained. And so Philip was like, oh, god damn it, Stucley, get out of my country, you are embarrassing me. So once again, Stucley was, well, this time he at least wasn't put in prison, but he was forced out of Spain and once again lost all of his money. So that's the end of Stucley, right? You have been paying attention to this video, haven't you? Well, he wasn't, if anything else, a mercenary. So he decided, well, let's go back to being a soldier. Where can we fight? Well, currently, we can go to Rome. We've had some connection to the papacy before during all of these invasion ideas. So he went to Rome to basically siege any kind of work or support from the church itself. And while there, he got involved with the church, who then said, hey, we'll give you some ships and you can be our naval commander for a time. And as a naval commander, he actually fought very bravely and very efficiently in the Battle of Lepanto. Again, if anyone doesn't know what the Battle of Lepanto is, it was the great 1571 military victory of Catholic powers over the Ottoman Empire at, funnily enough, Lepanto, that checked and for a short while at least threw back the otherwise expanding Ottoman Empire on the seas in the Mediterranean. It's one of the great battles of history. Another one I have at least thought about making a video about, but, you know, with the rate I put out videos, God knows when that is going to be, if ever. However, Stucley fighting bravely once again made his star rise, and Philip was like, okay, we will take you back. Just come back here, old friend. You will now be once again one of our great people. So yeah, well, there we are. Once again, he was back in Spain. Again, he lived there for a couple of years, just waiting for a chance to go back and invade Ireland. That seems to basically have been his raison d'etre at the time. Find some ways to make money, gain power, and invade Ireland. I guess that was where he now wanted to be sovereign prince. I don't know. However, we are now in 1575. Stucley would have turned 50 this year, and as have been seen with many other people when they turned 50, it seemed like the big 5-0 was kind of a, oh crap, I might actually not be immortal. If I have to do something, I have to do it now. It has been seen many other times in history that that is the point. There is in fact some who think that the reason Hitler completely ignored his general's ideas that we need another couple of years before we start fighting a major war and start a Second World War was basically that he hit, 50 in 1939 and was like, okay, I'm getting older. Time to speed up things here. At any rate, at this point, Stucley was like, he started plotting with an almost manic energy. I mean, previously, as you can see, his star has risen and fallen. He was one of those, like I said, lovely, lovely rogues who might not have been as luckily, but at this point it was like, this plot, 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 and I need to be in charge of all of it. I need to be at the center of all of it because otherwise things are going terribly, terribly, terribly wrong, and I probably won't have time for it. However, nothing would actually happen until 1578. At that time, he convinced Philip to say, okay, if you guys can't invade, just let me do it. Give me some ships, just a few men. I will go to Ireland. I will raise a rebellion, which is overdue to happen anyway, because it's been 15 years since the last, and I will conquer Ireland on my own, make it Catholic, and then we can do whatever we want. Philip apparently either acquiesced or just, said, okay, take two or three ships and a couple of hundred men and get out of my hair, because that was at the very least what Stucley got. And in March of 1578, he set course for Ireland. Now, what is the biggest problems of general in the pre-modern era? No matter how good they were at strategy, at tactics, at leading men, the one thing none of them basically knew what to do was logistics. No military command had ever fallen down as much as by logistics during the pre-modern era, and this is basically what happened because he might have been a good military commander, he might have been a good plotter, but he didn't know jack about logistics. So just a month later, he managed to reach Cadiz. Though he had spent a full month just going through the Strait of Gibraltar, and when he reached Cadiz, his ships were so rotten they were no longer seaworthy. So yeah, Stucley was stuck in Cadiz, and without ships and with men who was basically, deserting because at this point he couldn't pay them very much either. So yeah, that did not go well. Okay, well, what to do? He wrote to Philip, say, help! And Philip was like, oh, good lord, go up to Portugal, my friend there, King Sebastian. He is doing something and he will probably want to help you. Just go up to Lisbon, talk to him. So, Stucley went. Now, Sebastian might eventually have been willing to help him, at least with another ship or something to get to Ireland, but the thing is, Sebastian himself was right in the middle of planning an invasion of Morocco. Why Morocco, you ask? Because Morocco was actually an ally of England in an alliance against Spain. Because, that's how politics work. So, Sebastian was going to go to Morocco, conquer Morocco, or at least spank the Moors down there, to get the alliance broken with Elizabeth. And he said, hey, you, Thomas, how do you like to be one of my sub-commanders in that one? And Stucley was like, sure, why not? That seems like a really, really good idea. Yeah. Ireland sucks. The only thing you have in Ireland is hunger and lice. He actually said that. Hunger and lice, that's all there is in Ireland. He probably, at this point it should be obvious he didn't believe that, but hey, it was a chance to get his star rising again. So he followed the Portuguese king down to Morocco to start the invasion there. Once they got there, Sebastian's tactic was basically to fight an aggressively defensive campaign. Despite being the invader, he realized that he was heavily outnumbered, and while his military was probably better than the natives, he figured it was better to use tactic and strategy to win this war rather than raw brute force, because that could have been a problem. Well, Stucley disagreed. I guess he wanted once more to prove his superiority as a military commander, or something like it, because he was like, you guys suck, let me show you what Englishmen and Italians can do. Why Italians? Well, that was because that was the force he was put in charge with. So he basically advanced in front of the king's forces and engaged the natives in the Battle of Alcázar Quibir. And he fought bravely. Everyone says he fought bravely, but that was when his luck ran out. Because early in the day, just as he was leading his men to an attack, a cannonball smashed into him, cut off his legs, and of course he died very early after from blunt force trauma and immense amounts of blood loss. A tragic end to a person who might otherwise have ended up giving us even more years of hilarity. Now, Stucley's death didn't mean that people were done with him, because he had somehow, like I said, he's not one of those who's very known today, but he was fairly well known in his time. I mean, with adventures like that, who can blame people for being interested in? Several big playwrights at the time, such as George Peele, for instance, actually made big plays about him for almost a generation after. Stucley was a fairly used cultural figure. People wrote him into books. They made plays about him. They did actual scholarly dissertations about him. And honestly, all things considered, can you really blame him? So yeah, that was Thomas Stucley of the Castle of Affeton. Not the best man in the world, probably not the worst man in the world either, but definitely a man with persistency and goals, and someone who lived his best life as you possibly can. Well, I hope this was all very interesting to you. I might be making more videos after this, who knows, at least now I'm back in the game, so I hope this was pleasing to you, Vanessa. I hope this was pleasing to everyone else. And until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.